The session title calls for us to discuss the good, the bad, and the unanticipated about pre-approval access in a pandemic. I want to challenge our panelists to add a fourth topic, which is to consider how to draw on the lessons learned to create policies that will make pre-approval access work better in the next pandemic. I'm going to make brief introductions, kind of highlighting our panelists' connections to pre-approval access, and encourage everyone to look at the conference material online for more complete biographies. We've already heard from Anne. She's discussed her compelling personal connection to pre-approval access, and obviously we've just heard from Peter Marks, who's on the front lines. Luciana Borio is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and partner at Arch Ventures. She's also been on the front lines as acting chief scientist at FDA during the Ebola outbreak and other emergencies, as a member of the White House National Security Council staff developing pandemic strategy, and in other capacities. Paul Aliyu, I hope I'm saying his name right, you'll correct me, he heads the Global Governance Office and the Chief Medical Office at Novartis, where his duties include leading the company's pre-approval access program. That job got a lot bigger as the pandemic spread around the globe and has forced Novartis to grapple both with the logistics of meeting enormous demand and the ethical issues around access and evidence. I'm going to start by asking each of the panelists a question, starting with Paul, and then we'll move to a discussion among everybody. So Paul, I want to start with two specific examples. In March 2020, Novartis made a commitment to provide over 120 million doses of hydroxychloroquine worldwide, and it started a clinical trial. In June 2020, it discontinued the trial because broad access had made it impossible to recruit patients. Ultimately, after millions of people had taken it, hydroxychloroquine was shown to have no effect in preventing or treating COVID. In April 2020, Novartis made its drug Jakavi available on a compassionate use basis to treat cytokine storm associated with COVID. Responding to demands from governments, Novartis shipped Jakavi all over the world. It also started and completed a trial extremely quickly. In December 2020, less time than it usually takes to just even start a trial, interim results were available and they revealed that Jakavi did not benefit COVID patients, at least hospitalized patients. So I want to ask you, Paul, to talk about the processes that Novartis undertook to decide that it should provide these agents, how Novartis ensured that access wasn't interrupted for patients who needed hydroxychloroquine or Jakavi for their approved uses, and what happened when it turned out that the drugs weren't effective in treating COVID.
No, thanks, Steve, for that question. And I mean, maybe just to give some context, and you already mentioned that, with the case of hydroxychloroquine, at the time there was emerging data showing that there might be some utility of the drug in COVID. The FDA had issued an emergency use authorization for the product. So it was on that basis that we did decide to provide the product. And largely, just maybe to highlight, it was provided to governments and ministries of health. So it was a national level provision where the use was like within defined national treatment protocols and pretty much in hospitalized patients. And we did encourage data collection. But just again to your point, for any of the provision, for any of these compounds which we had where there was some data that there could be utility in COVID, we made the decision to actually run proper randomized well-controlled trials. So we then had in parallel the hydroxychloroquine clinical trial that was running. In the case of Jakavi, ruxolitinib, as some may know it as, there was preliminary data from a small study in Wuhan suggesting that the drug might have a role in the cytokine storm. And there were kind of sporadic uses, like, because it's an approved product, actually. So we, a couple of centers were beginning to use that. We had, individual physicians, treating physicians responding to, requesting the product from us for COVID. And actually we had health authorities reaching out to us asking to start a program because depending on the country, as you probably may know, the physicians have to get approval from the health authorities prior to the company being able to provide the product. So you need the health authority approval, and then you need the company's willingness to provide the product. So that was kind of, again, the backdrop. I wanted to make that demarcation because in the case of Jakavi, we then had first the individual patient request, which we looked at, and then we then started off a program in there. And I think you mentioned something that was a conundrum there, because when you think about what was happening in March, April 2020 at the start of the pandemic, it was a crisis situation. So, one of the pieces we had to look at was how do we as a company, responsible company, respond to the needs of the healthcare community, especially in a time of crisis, as well as also as a drug developer, ensure we generate evidence, and robust scientific evidence on those compounds. And I think that was kind of the balance which we kind of had to look at to say, well, let's look at how we can make these drugs available, yet let's look at how we can generate data via the clinical trials. So I want to kind of, put that context in there. Now, in terms of some of our experiences and I think the learnings, 4 things maybe just to highlight, also for you, as you mentioned, from Novartis' experience, I think the first piece was we needed to simplify. Because whether it be the trial, you alluded to that, we needed to start up the trials quickly and get that running, but also for the expanded access programs or the compassionate use programs, we needed to streamline our processes, accelerate decision-making, accelerate the supply process. So we had our medical teams reviewing, the requests within 3 to 4 hours, and we had to ensure we could supply within 24 to 48 hours. I think that was the first piece. The second piece that comes to mind, and I think Peter alluded to it earlier, was in terms of data. So we need to also ensure that we could collect data from these programs, even though they were expanded access programs. So we did that via our online system. And the discussions internally was, we needed to keep that to a reasonable minimum so that we were not bugging these physicians. So it had to be data that we were already collecting, which was clinically meaningful, but something that would inform us of how patients are actually faring on these products while it was being provided by expanded access. And I think I already mentioned the clinical research piece. So for both compounds, we made that decision. We needed to get confirmatory data via clinical trials. And we also made the product available to requesting researchers. So there were a lot of investigator-initiated trials that were ongoing with both compounds, actually, so that we could at least get as much evidence as quickly as possible. And when you talk about the last component, which are the patients in label, I think one thing that was non-negotiable for us from the start was that patients who are getting this product via the clinic, like in label, we needed to ensure there was no disruption. So I think that was absolutely critical. And that involved, a whole lot of organizing and coordination internally, because we had to look at our manufacturing, we had to look at the forecast. There were teams, the manufacturing teams, looking at products and substance like forecasts over the next 2 years, because even from a trial perspective, what should happen if these trials become positive? And then from the expanded access piece, do we have enough to provide the patients? And I think one thing to highlight was the priority in any of all these programs was for patients to go into the clinical trial. I just wanted to kind of highlight some of those key points and things that we kind of took into consideration.
Thanks, Paul. I think we'll come back to some of those topics in the conversation later. I wanted to ask Anne, your story is extraordinary in many ways. One of the ways is your perseverance in the face of very difficult obstacles, including obstacles that shifted as a result of the pandemic. There are very few people, I think, who could have done what you did, and I would argue they shouldn't have to overcome all those obstacles. Are there changes that have been made as a result of the pandemic that have made access easier and the governments or companies should make permanent?
So yeah, well, I would say that even though this was a pandemic, I'm pretty sure a lot of people would have done the same. And there is nothing courageous or incredible about it, about willing to help your son first. But anyway, the pandemic was first very scary for us because it meant that everything was falling apart. We had this plan to travel to the US every 2 months. So all of a sudden, the question was, will we be able to keep on traveling? Or if not, will we be able to get the medicine whatsoever? And the good sides of the pandemic actually came to us very quickly because everything was organized for us to still have the medicine, even if we couldn't travel. So there was a huge solidarity and a huge collaboration that was put in place between our team here in Sweden and the team in the US, in Washington, so that everything would be organized around our son. So it saves us all the hassle of traveling every 2 months. And I must say, you know, we were traveling like in 48 hours. We would go and then, you know, spend one day in Washington and come back. So it was really, really tiring for my child and us, the parents. It also saves us money to actually avoid the traveling, because then we were able to just stay at home, get all the checkups here in Sweden. Every exam was paid by our healthcare system. So there was a lot of things that were covered that wasn't the case when we had to travel. So it's actually, to me, it actually showed that this could be something that is more flexible. The way we think expanded access can be flexible, can be moved around and in the favor of the patient, because it's much more better now. We were happy with the pandemic, I must say.
Great. Well, thank you. And I think you make a good point. It's hard to imagine anybody arguing that it would be better to go back to a situation where a family like yours would have to be traveling back and forth from Europe to the United States every 2 months. Peter, I want to follow up on some of the things that you mentioned in the talk right before ours. By definition, emergency use authorization it's a form of pre-approval access. The drugs are investigational. It's been used extensively in the pandemic. I think reflecting on the title of the session, most people would agree that EUAs for COVID vaccines are in the kind of the good bucket, right? But there's some more debate about the convalescent plasma, which CBER regulates. You mentioned it. Hundreds of thousands of Americans have received convalescent plasma, first through a massive expanded access program and then under an EUA. That huge expansion of use didn't just happen. It was promoted by President Trump and by the then FDA Commissioner Stephen Hahn. And I'm wondering if you can reflect a little bit more on that. Are there lessons there for the future? Looking back on it, did convalescent plasma help patients? You know, would it have been better to have restricted its use to controlled trials? Would that have even been possible?
No, it's a really good question, and hindsight's always great. At the time, I think this goes back, we had very few therapeutics to use at the time. There was a risk-benefit that was done, the risk of a unit of plasma versus the potential benefit. And the data that came out of this was that we did learn that that people who were treated early on with convalescent plasma did seem to have some benefit, and people who were treated later on when they were had the inflammatory phase of COVID-19 didn't benefit at all. And it would have been nicer to learn that sooner rather than later, which is what we came to. And so could we have learned that more quickly? Probably we could have. Did it take, did it get sorted out? I think it got sorted out eventually, and it continues to get sorted out. Convalescent plasma had a small effect size, which was also an issue. But when you have as many people that were sick, it may have had a beneficial effect. And I think we'll see. I think at the end of the day, I'm not going to lose too much sleep about convalescent plasma, because I think the data that are emerging, particularly from Argentina, some of the studies out of Johns Hopkins and other places, show that in the right population, with the right titer, and you're going to hear more about it later today, it could potentially be of benefit. Again, I think it would have probably been better to have studies that were able to get going more quickly. But, you know, we all were reacting to a once in a lifetime. It's very easy. It's very easy right now to sit here in 2 years down the line and be a Monday morning quarterback. At the time, there were people dying. People were very scared. And we were trying to do what we're supposed to do, which is to try to do things that will help the public health. Now, I don't think there was, could things have been done somewhat better? Yeah, probably, but I think it was done all with good intent. I think if I had to go back and do anything differently, it was that there were some scientific things that we could have done better very early on, such as understand the actual titering of the units, such as putting in place some of the actual nuts and bolts of what would have allowed us to use high quality product early on. Those things didn't happen for a variety of reasons. And that probably is what I regret even more than anything about the extent of use, that we didn't know that the nature of the product we were using in terms of the antibody content. So a long way of saying that I think that, yes, it could have been done better, but no, I don't think it was a total catastrophe either.
Well, maybe we'll get back to this. Maybe we'll probably talk about some other things. Lou, COVID isn't the first time the US or the world has faced tough choices about pre-approval access in the face of a viral outbreak. You were acting chief scientist at FDA during the Ebola outbreak, and you pushed for rigorous trials and resisted calls to only provide unproven therapies on a compassionate use basis. How does that experience compare to what's been happening over the last 2 years? And to the extent there's a difference, is it because it's easier for the US government to make tough choices about access for people who are far away compared to making those choices for people who are right here?
First of all, Steve, thank you so much for including me in this discussion. I'm really, really thrilled to be here with you today. I don't think that explains the difference, because no secret that I'm very much for access through large, pragmatic, randomized trials that are reliable, that are efficient, and that are inclusive. And I don't think that we have to sacrifice reliability to get this speed and inclusivity that the crisis demands. We are not able today to do what the UK did, for example. We don't have the infrastructure. We have the capabilities, but we don't have the infrastructure to link, throughout the nation to be able to do this the way the UK, our healthcare system is very different. But we could do a lot better than what was done. And an example was, the study that the NIH did for remdesivir. It began on February 21st and ended on April 19th and enrolled about 1,000 patients. It was a randomized controlled study, and it was a really important study to give us the first antiviral drug therapy that was shown to be safe and effective to treat COVID at the time in hospitalized patients. And now it's been expanded, of course, to outpatients as well. So, I think that my thinking about this really goes back to 2003, SARS-CoV-1. This is when I first began to get involved in these types of public health emergencies. And then we can go to, a series of emergencies where the lessons are there. It's pretty simple that, unless you do this very complicated work of doing clinical trials, we delay knowing what really helps or really hurts patients. And if we don't do that, we end up relying on highly unreliable data to make decisions. And the sooner we can figure out what works and what doesn't, the more patients we can help and avoid therapeutic misadventures. So I think that I take issue with this idea of pandemic exceptionalism, that, it's a crisis and we have to do things differently. We have repeatedly shown that that's a failed premise. It doesn't bring us success or healthier patients. It's counter to FDA's prior approach based on many years of lessons learned, and an NAS, National Academy of Science study that the HHS and FDA commissioned right after the Ebola outbreak of 2014. So I think also that we have to be careful with, how taking these actions, that it may be done in the best intention by the FDA, but the fact that they are endorsing a product that leads to more unintended consequences and greater use, and delayed actually the conduct of a lot of other trials that were important trials. I think it's no secret that Regeneron and others had slow enrollment initially because there was so much out of trial use of these, in a way, endorsed products by the FDA. Yeah, so I think we can and we must do better here. And I don't think that the fact that the crisis is overseas makes any difference to what how we should tackle it here.
Well, thanks. And there's a lot there. And if anybody wants to comment on any of the things that other people have said before I go on to the next question, let's do that.
Yeah, no, this is Peter. I'd actually like to comment on something that I do think we have to think about here, which is that it is one of the things that did happen in the expanded access program for plasma was that it was actually used in over 2,500 sites across the United States. This was a product that was used in places that would never have seen clinical trials conducted. And that probably remedying that problem for the future is probably something that we do need to think about doing. I mean, expanded access did allow a potential therapeutic to get out there to a very broad range of places that would never have had the potential to see participation in that. I don't disagree with Dr. Borio at all that it is much preferable to have the trials conducted the way they should be. We just need to figure out how to have an infrastructure in place to allow that to have equitable access across the entire country when we get into these pandemic situations.
I want to move on to another related question, which is, and for all of you, when the pandemic fades, and hopefully, that's not going to be too long, but eventually it will, there's going to be pressure to apply the emergency use authorization pathway for other drugs, because after all, every day is an emergency for somebody who's affected by a serious disease that has no effective treatment. Has the COVID experience changed the way FDA and society think about pre-approval access? Is there or should there be a fundamental difference in the threshold for granting pre-approval access to investigational drugs and compassionate use outside of a public health emergency? Let's start with, I don't know, let's start with Peter, because that's most directly an FDA issue, and then I'd like to ask everybody else that.
Yeah, no, I think we can talk about pandemic exceptionalism or not, but I think in this case, the pandemic is a declared public health emergency. I think there are lessons learned here that we will take with us to how we go about approving other products, how we can get there more quickly. But I don't think there's like an expanded, I don't think there's a emergency use authorization type pathway, or even I'm not even sure that expanded access should change a whole lot as we move forward. I think what can change is the way we go about interacting with sponsors to determine endpoints, and we do so in a very proactive manner. The way we very thoughtfully design trials, the way we think about practical endpoints. I think that is clearly something coming out of this pandemic, that practical endpoints can be very helpful, and that streamlined clinical trials can be helpful. So I think we take the best of what we've learned from doing clinical trials during the pandemic and apply that. And I'm not sure that you really change the authorization or approval standard a whole lot going forward based on this.
And from your perspective, from the perspective of somebody who's accessing drugs before they're approved, do you think that there should be a different way that society and that regulators should think about pre-approval access? There are things that have happened that have kind of wakened people up.
Yeah, really, because I think if we can avoid, the struggle it is to get access to expanded access when it's not accessible in your own country, for example, in my case, if this can be changed, it's a very it's very important for the parents, you know, to actually spend all their energy on something else than fight for getting access to a drug. So it's really about thinking the whole process without the obstacles that we can find now, I think.
Paul, any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And I was also just to piggyback on something Peter said, you know, earlier on. I think, you know, when I look at how things evolved with the pandemic, I mean, it's very easy to kind of blame one thing versus the other. And actually, when you look at some of the information, I don't think expanded access was really the problem. You know, I think the convalescent plasma was an outlier. I mean, when you look in clinicaltrials.gov, there was less than 30 expanded access programs, and largely majority of them were convalescent plasma, versus hundreds of clinical trials that were being conducted. So I think one of the learnings actually going forward in the future is maybe to have a bit more of a central coordination effort, where we have actually maybe bigger trials or better coordinated trials, because quite a lot of these trials were probably too small and underpowered to actually yield any valuable results. So I think that really was that's one of the key learnings. And then to Anne's piece about, you know, the patients, I think from a company perspective, and this applies, I think, for every company, is also in terms of how do we make expanded access more available and accessible to patients, irrespective of where they are globally. And I think that's something that we as a company take seriously. And I know a lot of other companies are looking into that, because during the pandemic, I think, as Anne alluded to, we have to think differently, even about clinical trials. It's like, what can be monitored closer to the patients, you know, remotely? How do we get drugs to patients? Like, should these patients always need to travel miles to come and get the drug? And I think these were things for years we maybe took for granted, actually, that every patient needed to come to a center, they need to travel somewhere else. And it's kind of rethinking that model, you know, which is, I think, one of the things that's also kind of happening right now at the moment. And I'm hopeful that post the pandemic, whatever that is, a lot of that will really be integrated into how we run clinical trials, as well as how we do expanded access.
Lou?
Yeah, you know, I just going back to the initial question about the EUA authorities, and I think it's really interesting that there is this belief out there that, you know, the law says that FDA has its authorities, and as long as the benefits outweigh the risks, and et cetera, doesn't mean that FDA is compelled to act on those authorities. They give it, you know, extraordinary flexibilities, and I think it's remarkable that FDA has them, and it's fantastic. But it needs to be used very responsibly. And so I think there's a distinction to be made between having the authority and being compelled to use it. And I think that FDA, you know, should really, for the next crisis, really think about, you know, the EUA authorities as the way we used to when I was there and Peggy Hamburg was commissioner, is that it's a system to really streamline broad access after we have more definitive data and reliable data that the product's benefits actually outweigh the risks. But, you know, there's a lifetime between knowing that and then having a product that is actually approved for use. We think that it would have been like unethical to withhold product that we know for sure the benefits outweigh the risks, but not rely on unreliable data to make those EUAs. I think the way the vaccines was handled was the right way. And that's a great example where we had very definitive data about the safety and efficacy of those vaccines when the EUA was issued. I think on the topic of authorities too, you know, this idea that we had a lot of small trials, a proliferation of them. Well, the fact is that a lot of them were actually, you know, institutions that were funded by the NIH, and every trial, clinical trial, had to go, you know, to the FDA for an IND review. So these federal agencies also have a role in allowing and permitting this proliferation of non-informative trials to have taken place. And similar to what we, you know, talk about the Defense Production Act as an authority the federal government has in an emergency, I think we should consider in the future to have kind of NIH FDA authorities to be the conductor of this complicated orchestra, because we don't want to end up in a similar situation where we have this proliferation of trials that have no prospect of actually giving us information that we need to care for patients.
So I want to move on to another topic. The pre-approval access suggests that a medicine's on the path to approval, that there's an ongoing search for the truth about its safety and efficacy. What about when that isn't the case, when there aren't any credible efforts to test it, or credible efforts have determined that it isn't safe or effective? You know, I kind of want to ask each one of you, what are the responsibilities of regulators, of companies, of investors, of the patient community in situations like that? Maybe I'll start with you, Paul. You know, there's never a situation where you can't find a physician somewhere who's going to say, whatever studies have been done are not definitive, there's flaws in them. I still think that this is the right thing for my patient. Are there times, including in a pandemic, when companies should just say no, or should they always defer to the patients and the physicians who are asking for access to unapproved drugs?
Well, Steve, that's a great question. I mean, firstly, maybe to, put that out there, for pre-approval access, compassionate use, whatever you want to call it, there are criteria which every regulator actually has in place. So I think it's important to highlight that. So it's not a kind of wild, wild west, it's not free for all. So there are the FDA, the EMA, all European countries, every agency actually that I know that has regulations in place have clear criteria that have to be fulfilled before the patient can get expanded access. I think that's the first part. Then you need a physician who's willing or convinced that there's enough evidence and actually wants to place that request. You need a patient, or caregiver who's consenting to actually use that. And then you need the company who's willing to provide the treatment. So there's so many stakeholders. And I think why I'm outlining that is, again, to your point, in the sense that the simple answer is no. It's not every product that a physician wants to use that a company should make available. And again, just because there's so many stakeholders there's so many checks and balances actually built into that process where, the regulator, be that the FDA or a national competent health authority, has to first assess that in the case of an individual patient, or in the case of a program, and give their okay. And then the company also has their own scientific and medical review and has to decide whether there's enough justification to provide that product. So I think the simple answer to that pretty much is, I think all those checks and balances that are there right now, when used adequately, actually do protect the patient. And I think to your point regarding the pandemic, yeah, we did have requests, because people want to throw the table and its kitchen sink at the COVID virus. So, we were turning down requests and saying no, because we had done a lot of our own internal due diligence to say, which of our drugs in our portfolio actually have some evidence to suggest that, there could be utility for COVID-19. So I think that's important. So the company itself, as a manufacturer, has a duty to do a scientific due diligence here, and then you have the regulators have to check. Well, you also have the ethics committees, actually, which I haven't mentioned, the IRBs and the ethics committees. So there's so many checks in place in terms of, before a patient actually gets the product to use under expanded access or compassionate use.
So, but is there is part of that, and is any of this on the company, a check to say, a trial's been done and the question's been answered? For example, with Jakavi, Novartis did the trial, and it was amazing how quickly that you got the results, and you announced the results and said it doesn't seem to be helping hospitalized patients. That was very unfortunate, but it was really fortunate we got the results so fast. But I've noticed that after that, there have been plenty of other studies that keep being done. There are plenty of compassionate use accesses of the drug. Does that mean that there's really never a point where you say no, or how do you determine that? Or are you saying that should be the regulators that determine that, not the company?
I mean, I think it's both. I mean, there's a joint responsibility there. And maybe just to clarify regarding in the case of Jakavi, as I said earlier on, there was emerging data from an earlier study suggestive that.
I've lost Paul. Let's move on. Lou, Peter, thoughts about this?
I do think that there's a lot of, it should be more permissive for the individual requests. I think there should be a lot of latitude for approving those, because the patient and the physician at the bedside are in the best position to make a request that they deem to be in the best interest of the patient. My issue is more when you have a very systematic approach to product access that is much larger. So the larger expanded access programs is where I think the FDA needs to really, use its authorities very responsibly, so that we're not in a situation where we are undermining patient care, generation of definitive data, putting patients at risk for uncontrolled use of a product that, like we said at the FDA, right? All products have risks, some are effective, and that should be the premise. So I think there's a big distinction between the single patient INDs and the large programs.
Okay, Anne, any thoughts about this? You mentioned, that you that one of the things that you took away from this and that you spoke with your child about is the idea that physicians don't always have the last word, that the patients and their families can say no. What are your thoughts about whether regulators and companies should have the final say in determining what patients have access to?
I think it's always a question of discussion. Again, talking about what's your expectations, talking about what are the options with the physicians and the oncologists, and of course I understand the difference between being a special case or on a larger scale, that the rules must be different. But as a patient, it's always hard just to hear a no. It's a no-go for you. It's something that is too difficult to handle. So it's again all about discussion.
Paul, are you back with us?
Yes, I am. Apologies for that.
Okay. I'm glad you made it back. Do you have thoughts about? I don't know if you heard the discussion, but the questions really are about what happens when the evidence suggests that there isn't something isn't likely to be effective. I think you already answered it, but I'm wondering if you have any more to say on that.
Yes, I think one thing you mentioned, which I kind of wanted to touch on very quickly, was once we had data from any of the studies, or either from any of the readouts that were coming through, that any of these compounds was not effective, every form of access was stopped. So it was discontinued. I think it's important just to reiterate that. So in actual fact, the hydroxychloroquine trial, we stopped that early because already, there was data coming from all the other big studies, there was data from recovery. So there was no point actually continuing to enroll even in our own trial. So we did discontinue our trial early based on, robust evidence that was coming out. And that was exactly the same for any of the supplies going to the countries. And we did exactly the same with Jakavi and roxolone, that the minute our trial read out and showed that it showed that it was equally as safe, but it wasn't, the efficacy was not there. Every form of access was also stopped.
So I want to move on to the kind of the third leg of our charge here, was to talk about the unanticipated. And I think, Peter, you probably had more unanticipated than anybody. I don't think anybody could have anticipated all the things that have happened. Any things that you want to highlight that have been things that were really unanticipated that you think are important related to pre-approval access in the pandemic?
Well, I think, look, I think the number one unanticipated thing was how fast an expanded access program that was originally designed for a few thousand people turned into one for about an order of magnitude more than that. So that, I think, was an unexpected surprise that in retrospect, we should have had something in place better to avoid, or to modify something. There should have been something there. I think that so that was unexpected. I think the rest of things, I mean, we've had unexpected things, but not so much to do with access per se. They've had to do with what the virus has, the twists and turns that the virus have shown us over the course of time.
Just to interrupt really quickly, looking at it from the outside, I think a lot of other people think that one of the things was unanticipated was the pressure from the public, from politicians to provide access to therapies in COVID, especially some of the ones where there really wasn't much evidence for it. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah, no, that's a good point. So there was pressure for various therapies here. Some which had some scientific basis, some which had very poor scientific basis, some which ultimately were to be shown to have be effective, but people wanted these things before we actually had the data that showed that they were effective. And that actually reflects what happens at the FDA all the time. We have people looking for access to products that are not effective because they believe that they might be effective because of anecdotal things that are on the web. We have people that are looking to get access to products that ultimately, once the trials are completed, are shown to be effective, and they just would like to have access earlier. The problem is we don't. If we had a crystal ball, we'd know that up front, but we don't have a crystal ball. So what we saw in the pandemic was, in some ways, it was a little bit like taking what we see normally at FDA and putting it on steroids, right? Because there were just so many more products and so many more demands and asks. But it is part of what we just have to do, is make sure that what goes out there has a reasonable scientific basis behind it, and that ultimately the calculus here is that we are confident that it's going to be helping people and not hurting them. Obviously that's the lowest bar. When we start to think about things that we authorize and approve, we actually want to make sure that the bar is actually in a place where we're actually pretty sure that we're actually helping people, or that we have we've met a reasonable standard of evidence.
Lou?
Sure. So I was surprised about how quickly FDA issued the EUAs for things like hydroxychloroquine or convalescent plasma. And the other thing that surprised me was that even within the scientific community that understands this, they were not able to shake the misconceptions that they should have been able to. And the two key ones here is the role of repurposed drugs and the role of large data sets. Any person who really, does clinical trials and think about the clinical trials knows that repurposing is almost always unsuccessful. I can't think of a success story for an emergent infectious disease. I'm not talking about for the therapeutic areas, but for BIDs, there's a long history of trying to repurpose products, and they don't really necessarily work. So you really need to do the proper trials to assess each product on its own merit. And the other one is this large data set problem, which there's this perception that maybe we can correct from some of the statistical limitations that are intrinsic to observational studies, but we really can't. But it surprised me that the scientific community, I think still to this day, thinks that there's a role for repurposing and large data sets in the next emergency.
And I guess everything that's happened to you has been anticipated personally, but any thoughts about what's unanticipated?
Everything was very scary for us. Not to have access to the drug was the main concern, like getting access to it, or having to hear that because of the pandemic we couldn't the provision of the drug couldn't be done, or those kind of things was really scary. Now to talk about what Lou just said, it's I understand also the anecdotal practical, sorry for that, it shouldn't be taken so much into account. But again, as a parent or caregiver, if you have like 100% of chance that a drug works for your child, you take that chance, and even if it's anecdotic. So it's also from the caregiver's side, what can be said relatively honestly, not to give, false hopes and everything, but at the same time, if that can save the life, even if it's only one, does it matter or not?
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, just to piggyback on, what Lou said, because I mean, in some sense, when you think about it, actually, within this pandemic, there's been a lot of, success with repurposed drugs. So maybe we also want to rethink that. It's just that you need to study them within proper clinical trials. I mean, the recovery gave us dexamethasone, very, very early on. We have tocilizumab now. There is, even remdesivir, you could argue, was sort of repurposed in a way. There's now baricitinib. So there are drugs actually that have largely been repurposed and that are, have shown utility in clinical trials with the current pandemic. So I think in some ways you could say maybe that was unanticipated, because to your point, in the infectious disease world, there was always the thinking that repurposed drugs don't necessarily work. But actually, when studied properly within the context of a clinical trial and evidence is generated, we have seen with this pandemic. So in actual fact, there probably is a rethink of what other drugs can we repurpose actually for some other indications based on preliminary scientific evidence that's available. So I think that's one piece.
That's well said, Paul. That's really well said. And I think it's important to clarify that that it merits the diligence and the studies, and not embrace it because of the idea that in vitro activity equals in vivo efficacy, right? So yeah, thank you for that clarification. I think it's well put.
Absolutely, no, thanks for that. And I think I agree with you actually on the piece about the communication, and that was again for me something unanticipated. That even when scientific evidence becomes available, how is that communicated to the lay public? What is the difference between a full approval and an emergency use authorization? What does that mean? And I think there is an opportunity there, probably for the entire healthcare community, to own our narrative. How do we tell our stories, and how do we actually explain like scientific things, to the lay public? And I think that was one of the big, would say, unanticipated pieces for me, because there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there where people were struggling with what to believe actually with some of these therapies. When there's actually like real scientific evidence, rigor being generated. And there were, I was having conversations with family members and friends about what goes into running a clinical trial and what a proper clinical trial entails, and have there been shortcuts, and have things been done properly, and so I think that was another piece there, and how much information goes out very, very quickly. There are a lot of non-peer reviewed things, publications being put out there, being open to interpretation. So I think there are some things that those are all areas where I think we could improve as a healthcare community to own our narrative and the communication of science to the public.
Well, that's a good segue to what I wanted to get to next, which is really to ask each of you to consider how the lessons from COVID-19 should be applied, and to think about how things should be done better going forward, so that we're better prepared for the next pandemic, because I think everybody would agree that there is going to be a next pandemic. And I think that the most useful thing to do is to ask you to reflect on what the organization that you're a part of, or the kind of the stakeholder that you're part of, how you can change, rather, because it's more valuable to do that than to point at other people and say how they can change, I think, or how they should change. So since you were talking, maybe you're a good one to start with. What does the COVID experience lead you to think of changes that Novartis should undertake in the way that it approaches pre-approval access, either inside of during a crisis like a pandemic, or in the normal crisis that everybody who has a serious unmet medical need experiences?
I mean, Steve, one of the big pieces for us, which we're actually already implementing, is we could be faster, we could be more agile. And, that's kind of what you talk about in terms of process, because we were reviewing these patient requests because of the urgency within 3 to 4 hours during the pandemic. I mean, we had our medics almost on a 24-hour cycle looking at requests coming in from different countries, via online system. So that was one of these areas where we kind of thought, well, whether that 3 to 4 hours may not be sustainable, going forward, but we could be much faster than we've been in the past. So I think that agility was there, kind of streamlining the review. The supply of the drugs was another one, where we kind of had to look at some of the epicenters where they were getting a lot of requests, where they were needing it. It's being used in the context of an ICU, and these patients were hospitalized. So how do we get these drugs to the patients faster? So these are some of the things that we were doing, we had to do during the pandemic, that there are learnings for us that even for a big corporation, we can be agile, and we can move these things. Then the data collection is the other one that, we encourage the physicians to collect data, some form of data, like wanted to know what's happening with these patients. And that's something, again, that ingrained now into most of our programs moving forward on the expanded access, that while we wouldn't do any expanded access program in isolation, we would always study within a clinical trial context. But within expanded access, we will look to gather clinically meaningful data, because actually what we experienced was a lot of the physicians did provide that information. Once it's simple, once it's information they're already collecting, and once it's information that, it doesn't take too much time. I mean, we trimmed it down to what we call 5 key questions for us. So I think those were all areas for us where there were learnings. And, that's another thing that we hope to take forward.
And before I move on to somebody else, I want to say that we're approaching the end of our time for the panel pretty soon, and we're going to switch over to Q&A. There are a few questions in the chat channel now, but if you have other questions, please put them in the chat channel, and I'll get to as many of them as I can. So moving forward, thinking about the future, Peter, your thoughts about policies. You've already talked a little bit about the kind of the need to improve evidence collection. Any other thoughts of things and policies, ways that FDA should change or think about changing moving forward based on your experience in the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think moving forward now, we have a lot more experience with what makes sense for the expanded access programs, I think, and what makes sense for our emergency use authorization. I think in going back also, we can probably avoid some of the issues that occurred with expanded access programs getting out of control in size. I think we'll be better prepared to prevent that from happening. I think we'll also be better prepared in how to guide sponsors. I mean, that's things that we can do, right? We can help guide sponsors better. We can help. We can help in the advice that we give. It is challenging because, unfortunately, no matter how much we say, there are people that try to do trials that sometimes are less than optimal, but we can, again, try to do our best to help guide people towards avoiding trials that don't generate the kind of data that will advance the field because they're too small or not well powered, and guide them to what will. So I think we would. My learning here is that is probably to understand our limits of where we want to go, and also to help be as forthcoming with the advice that we can give sponsors in terms of how they would best pursue their development programs.
Lou?
Well, Steve, it's work at Arch, and we are the largest investors for early stage life sciences company, and there's a very deep commitment in the company to fund companies and technologies that can offer an improved streamlined pandemic response, preparedness and response. And we're looking at the whole gamut of companies and technologies that can play a role. Some I'm not at liberty to discuss yet because they are stealth or have not been announced, but the commitment runs deep within the company.
So
And a lot of it involves, clinical trials and generation of evidence and things like that.
Anne, I want to give you the last word on this. Are the things you think that patients or patient groups should do, ways that they should change to make life better for people like you who need access to unapproved therapies?
So from the patient side, I would say, again, discussion and information. We know that, all those regulations and laws and everything are not done, to be an obstacle for us to get a drug, but more to regulate all the access for those new drugs and everything, and control that. But maybe, discussing always, being a case that maybe is unique, but then can also help change things, move them around, just be a part of the circle that makes things evolve also into access and expanded access to new drugs.
So I want to shift to asking some of the questions that were submitted in the chat channel. There's one here. I think Paul's probably well positioned to answer, but anybody else can chime in on it also. Expanded access or emergency processes exist in the United States, but they don't exist everywhere in the world, and the regulatory systems aren't as fast everywhere in the world as they are in the United States or in Europe. Do you have thoughts about that and how to improve on the equity of access, either through expanded access or drugs that are or therapies that are approved through emergency access in parts of the world where they don't have regulatory systems that are as nimble as they are in the United States and Europe?
No, I can start with that because that also is an interesting comment, because parts of it is true, parts of it are actually not so true. The FDA has a very well evolved and very kind of mature regulation when it comes to expanded access or preapproval access. So that's correct. But then actually, a lot of countries do have some form of regulation. So it's not like they don't have some form of regulation. Now, having said that, the maturity or the robustness of that regulation, it varies, across countries. When you think about, our personal experience, which I can share, we provide about 10,000, we get about 10,000 requests. We grant about 95% of them. And consistently over 100 countries where we get requests from. So, there is some regulatory framework that actually allows us to provide to patients in those countries. Now, the speed of approval, be that regulatory, be that ethics committees, be that physician or patient awareness, I think it varies. And this is where I think there is an opportunity. And just also for kind of awareness, one of the things we have taken up as a company, and we're working with other industrial partners right now, as well as collaborators, is looking at ways in which we can strengthen that regulation or the policy, across different countries. So we've actually worked with a couple of regulators to kind of share some of our experiences, especially when we get a request from there. And we see some of the bottlenecks in trying to get, the drug over to patients in those countries. So I think there is a role, for everyone, including the industry, which I think that's something, as I said, we're championing right now and looking at opportunities to work with stakeholders to do that. But I think also there's an opportunity for mature agencies like the FDA to also kind of, probably take a big brother role, you may want to call it, in helping to strengthen, because there's a lot of great things happening. We talked about Project Facilitate within the FDA. The FDA has the EUA, the expanded access program's been there. There's so many things where the FDA is kind of leading in this space, where I think there's an opportunity to actually help some of the other health authorities, like national health authorities.
So I want to ask all of you, anybody else who wants to chime in on this, maybe broaden it out a little bit, not only equitable access globally, but thoughts about equity of access within the United States and within Europe, because I think that one of the things that's been that the pandemic has really shined a spotlight on has been the lack of equity in access to medicine, certainly in the United States. Peter, I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, well, but I think this is an opportunity to repair the problem with clinical trials in general in the United States and probably globally, which is that clinical trials are done in academic. Listen, I'm an academic by training. They're done in academic centers. This is not a knock on academic centers, but the people who use the products ultimately are located in communities. And to the extent that we can use this as an opportunity to be able to start to move towards more community-based access to investigational products, it could be very helpful in the United States and potentially globally, especially because in the age now that a lot of stuff can be captured using things like cell phones, remote devices, that might be helpful, and it may allow us in the future to roll out trials in a pandemic setting in a much more facile way, so we don't get into the problems of needing expanded access programs that get us into trouble.
Yeah, and so Steve, I think that it's a great point that we need to bring trials to where patients are and offer them the opportunity to enroll no matter where they are. But I think it's also important that for some patients, especially those with rare diseases and and progressive diseases, that even when they are close to an academic center or find their way there, they're not eligible for enrollment. And if we're not including those patients in the trials, then the trials are not done right, because we have to also consider that. We have to make it inclusive of the patients who actually exist out there in the community, and not cherry pick the kind of patients we include in these trials.
And I think that also speaks to Anne's experience, because you described something. I mean, you just described it very quickly, but it sounds like a horror to travel all the way from Europe to the United States to get an MRI, and then to find out that your child's not eligible for the trial. I can't imagine that. It seems to me that there's something went seriously wrong there. You should have either known about it before you left, or the trial should have been inclusive enough that that you could have participated in it. I'm sorry, we're still not the same thing. Can you do whatever you need to do? Let's go to Peter, and then I'll come back to you, because I do want to hear what you have to say about that. Peter, did you have some thoughts about that now?
I mean, I obviously, I think one of the things that I think we probably, this is an aside for another meeting, but around the rare disease area, there is an incredibly desperate need for global regulatory convergence, because it is really a disservice to people with rare diseases that they don't get. I mean, if we could all agree that in this particular very small populations, that perhaps we could live with one another's differences and come to some global understanding of clinical trials and manufacturing practices could be generally applicable, we might be able to have broader access for all our populations. I'm talking about every different countries. Rare disease patients would have easier access, because it's untenable for companies to have to go to deal with the regulatory idiosyncrasies, whether it be ours here when they're operating, first in Asia, or in Europe, then us in this. So I think there's a really good case to be made here in that regard.
And can you try again?
Yes, so it was a tough time, to go to the US to actually hear that my son couldn't be eligible to this clinical trial, especially because we've never heard about expanded access before. So for us, it was really closing the door on our hopes. Eventually, we had this luck to be in connection with an American association who could lead us to the expanded access. Otherwise, we would have come back to Europe, and that was it. So it is to me, that's, I think, it's so unfair on families to be dependent on the country you live in to get access to a drug. I am totally 100% with an international regulation that would allow anyone to get into expanded access or a clinical trial. And moreover, when it's a rare disease, then you need to have cases. So what's the point to refuse people if you need to have cases and be able to, to have patients entering your trial and get the data? So that's really where I'm totally, I will fight for it.
Well, thank you. I'm told that that's all the time that we've got.